Jelena, thank you very much for asking me to come and present my research on the sibling experience of transplant. And I think for the last day and a half, we've been pushing boundaries, talking about robotics, talking about really pushing those boundaries. But I want to bring us back to the very basic reason of actually the fact that renal disease is a life-limiting, very significant lifelong disease, and the impact that it has on the families that we look after. And what I've done here is I've tried to give the siblings a voice, because for many of them, they're completely invisible to us. Not only geographically invisible, because the way the renal units are spread around the country, they may be 50, 100 miles away from us, but they're also psychologically and emotionally invisible to us, because they are, our focus is purely on the transplant recipient and on the parent that's sitting in front of us. So like them or hate them, they're actually a significant part of our lives. And in actual fact, nearly 50% of the world's population has a sibling. It's positive, it's negative. It's so variable and complex, this relationship, because right throughout our cognitive stages of development, these siblings are there. And it may be your age gap, the gender difference, the number of siblings, the family makeup that makes it more complex. But it's actually one of the longest relationships we have in our lives. In actual fact, it precludes the parent-child relationship. The longevity is such that it is one of the most complex relationships we have. But what happens if a chronic illness is put into this family that's pottling along nicely? Now, the literature will tell you that a chronic illness is anything that lasts longer than 3 months. But as we know, sitting in this room, our renal disease and transplantation is far more than 3 months. Now, if your siblings and your specialty was oncology and or cardiology, I could tell you an awful lot about sibling experience. There are hundreds of papers, hundreds of projects carried out, and lots of interventions for siblings of those specialties. But are renal kids different? Well, I wish I knew. I wish I was able to share a huge amount of data, because in actual fact, there is very limited. Before my study, this is all I was able to find, and my initial reaction when I started to search the literature was that actually someone 5 years after the first kidney transplant that actually happened, not quite in this building, but in these grounds in England, actually thought about the impact of the family. And I thought, wow, isn't this amazing? But actually they were looking at personality disorders and personality aspects of the family rather than the experience. It was an American study, and they actually felt that people should in actual fact be assessed for personality issues before embarking on end-stage replacement therapy. Fast forward 12 years and we actually have a British study also now actually mentioning siblings in there, and I felt quite positive about this. But again, they weren't actually listening to the children. In actual fact, this study primarily looked at school teachers and their opinions. In actual fact, they found huge negative impacts on parents, but actually felt that the children, either the recipients or siblings, didn't appear to have an effect within a year post-transplant. And then it all went quiet. It didn't appear to think that we were considering family impacts again, until the Nottingham group with Alan Watson looked at the impact of chronic kidney disease. And in that group, they actually had children who were still preemptive and conservatively managed, children who were on dialysis and transplant. So while it had huge merits in its study, it still was dividing those across the huge domains of treatment. So I wanted to think, what was it like? And in actual fact, for many of us, one particular case will stick out in our career. And for me, it was one family, particular family, who in actual fact had transferred to adult services when both one of the consultants and I was away. So they got in touch with us about 6 months later and asked to come back and see the team to say thank you for the previous 18 years of care. We made an arrangement to see them outside of clinic hours, and we all looking forward to seeing them, and the parent and the recipient walked in, the donor mother and the recipient. And she explained that the previous 2 weeks, when they had discussed with their other children that they were going to London to see the transplant team, she said they were shocked by the impact on the family, that the children suddenly had this cathartic episode of just how nightmarish their childhood had been. For the 13-year-old who had been 5 when her brother had received a transplant, they said that in actual fact one of the most stark experiences for her was that if Mom's car wasn't outside the home on the day of a clinic visit, she didn't know if she'd see her for a month or for a few hours. And in actual fact, she said we couldn't even bribe them to come and see you. So it was a really significant turning point for me. I think the thing that made me think more about this family was that Dad was a professor of medicine and Mom was a nurse. So in actual fact, articulate, educated, involved in the medical world, but they had not seen what was happening under their eyes with their own children. It made me want to think what was happening under my eyes. So I thought of my study in it. Just so happened that I was studying for an MSc at the time, so it quite came in good timing. But I wanted to give these young people a real voice, an in-depth way of expressing. I didn't want to use timescales, I didn't want to use questionnaires, I just wanted to listen to them. And that's what I did, because I undertook a phenomenological work which actually explores this real deep experience. Just looked at 10 young people because it's actually quite a large amount of group, and I was completely blinded by those that were approached, because I have a long-term relationship with these families, and while these siblings aren't exactly patients, they are completely ingrained in that family. So for my 23 young people who were fitting the criteria of between 10 and 17, I was then given 10 young people who were meeting the criteria of that age group of at least transplanted 6 months, so that they were back at home, that their sibling was back to school, etc., etc. And they wanted to just tell us what things were like. And in actual fact, it is a voice, and I want them to share their voice. So you'll see in your packs, I mean, you've probably seen it before now, before I show you, but actually the italics is their words rather than my bit. Some of these young people, in actual fact, 2 of them had an acute episode, and their young person had ended up being in end-stage renal failure pretty much overnight. They had never been in hospital before. Their brother or sister was admitted with meningitis. And so the actual experience of going initially to their local hospital and then being shipped up to London was quite horrendous for them. They were really traumatized, some of these a couple of years later. I would have said mortality is actually quite low in our centre, but in actual fact, this was a significant impact for them. People were just dying. They thought older people died, not younger people. And then, of course, these siblings, in many of the cases, had their parents undergo the donor nephrectomy at a similar time. So, in actual fact, when they went to see their mom or dad, that's what made them think. The fact that he had this breathing thing on, they were really quite concerned what was happening. And in actual fact, we're also separated in that the Children's Hospital is a couple of kilometres away from here. I thought interestingly this bottom quote from the young man whose mother had in actual fact was proceeding along the live donation route, and then I cannot remember exactly what had happened, but it had been stopped and they went the deceased donor route, and he in actual fact just felt that his mother had been saved from that, and he felt really happy. So it's quite extraordinary when you get 400 hours of 400 sheets of paper, 400 huge amount of data back from qualitative interviews, that actually the themes just jump out at you. Now the top 2 in actual fact were shared with many of those cardiology and oncology patients, talking about parental attention, how it's divided in the family, talking about information needs. But in actual fact, what I also saw was that these siblings actually showed a real maturity beyond their chronological age. And in actual fact, as I said, some of us hate our siblings or love them, but actually there was this real invisible bond that they looked after them. And also, really quite surprisingly, for many, it actually enriched their lives. So again, I'm just going to go through these and sort of just let them speak for themselves, give them their voice. That for many of them, they actually felt that they understood that their parent had to be in London, that their parent had to be with the other sibling. But in actual fact, what really upset them was the fact that that inattention actually continued even when their sibling was quite well. They knew they got told off more than the sibling that was sick. And in actual fact, one actually described the fact that the transplant recipient used to stand behind the mother and sort of nod as if to say, I know I'm getting away with this. They struggled with that. They struggled with the fact that they were being farmed out, shipped around from godparent to aunt to uncle to family friend, and that actually no one really asked, were things okay with them? And this, as I said, was an average 3 years post the experience. I think when we think we need to know, now for many of these young people on that initial diagnosis, they did spend some time at the hospital. They were able to live in our Ronald McDonald House. They were around and able to go to school at Evelyn in London. But in actual fact, we quite often ignored them. They were a sort of inconvenience. It wasn't really suitable to have them there. So they felt we switched into a different language, sort of sent to the room, and that they weren't included in what we needed to know. One of the things the siblings said was if they'd only had things explained a little bit better, they wouldn't have felt so scared. They felt that the recipient got everything explained, the play specialist, etc., but they were there on the sidelines, really scared, and many of the times just the words we were using. In actual fact, it's quite amazing that they stayed so sane for most of it. I think one of the big things that came out was that we didn't offer at that time. We didn't offer the ability for them to spend some time with a play specialist. We didn't offer time for psychology. So things have improved, as I'll show you in a bit. Now, these young people were 10 to 17 at the time of these interviews, but in actual fact, they had been age 6 upwards from the time of their experience. And in many ways, and I think when it's looked back on in the rose-tinted glasses, you know, young people saying, actually, I didn't mind about the newest phone, the newest computer. I'm not sure in reality do they really think that, but actually on this occasion they were being given free rein for what to say. I still think they'd like the new phone. I think it was quite amazing that maturity showed that they could see that their parents were having a rough time. One of the young men said they had never seen their mother cry before, and actually to find her at the bottom of the stairs crying one day, burnt out and exhausted, he was able to see as a young person this huge impact. It was one of the reasons why they felt they couldn't argue and couldn't promote the need for extra help. But as I said, this is often happening 50 plus miles away from our transplant centres. And it just makes you think that impact. We may think the transplant's going well, the function's going well, but in actual fact, this is all in the background. I like this quote because this young man is soon to be a 4th year medical student, and he was very adamant that he wasn't going to be defined by this experience. And it's now nice to look back on these many years later and see. As I said, love them or hate them, they're there, and there is this invisible bond of siblingship, as I've called it. And actually they did appreciate their young person. Some of them said they walked into school, some of their siblings still had nasogastric tubes, etc. And they were proud of them, they looked out for them, they supported them. They actually felt, wow, he's still around, or they're still around. And it was good. I mean, most of the parents will tell you afterwards that they were still very much fighting at times and arguing, but in actual fact they still appreciated them and they still look out for them. And they did feel that lucky. They did feel this invisible bond with them. I think it's quite extraordinary when a 13-year-old said that they hoped it was them. When that was explored further, part of it in actual fact evolved was that, yes, they did feel they wished it was them, but they also wanted to be with their mum and dad in London, that they actually wanted that special time when it wasn't just a separation. And again, just telling us, be supportive, be looking out for them, whether it's at school or at home. I think this was the thing that surprised me most of all. I wouldn't have thought any of them, given by what they'd told me, they felt that their lives had been enriched by it, but they very much came across with this idea that they felt better. They felt more confident. They felt more able to speak to school teachers, etc. They actually felt, I mean, for an 11-year-old to want to give something back, it doesn't even sound like a child statement, but in actual fact they wanted to give something back to the teams that had looked after their brother or sister. It's great to think that they were more confident. And interestingly, in this group of 10 kids, we have 3 medical students. We have 1 psychology student. And it's quite interesting how their exposure to our world has actually, in fact, added to their lives in some ways. I think the more friends came from the transplant games. We're very much involved in the transplant games here with our team and the guys like Gosh. And I think that allows them to have exposure to people who have a shared experience. So looking at what their needs are, as I said, they're often invisible to us. So I wanted to know, did they need us to do anything to support them? And I wanted them to be able to think proactively as well as looking back on their own experience. And very definitely it came out loudly that they would like support, but they were very definite to say they didn't want it to be compulsory. They certainly didn't want to be forced to go off to the hospital, but they wanted to be able to access support as and when they needed it. Some of them felt they very definitely didn't want this associated with school. They wanted their very separate lives, but they wanted to be able to be offered it. They wanted activities. We have a social group for teenagers at Evelina London that's run through our psychology department, and several of them knew that was there, but they weren't sure. They wanted something to do with transplant. They wanted, as they said, one of them to leave their transplantee brother at home and for them to have some kidney time. I also asked them, what would it be like if for a sibling who'd just been diagnosed, what would it be for other siblings? And I think really interestingly, they came back, every single one of them, and said they were happy to come in and be a supporter of other siblings and that they were happy to be contacted. I think the fact that it's not a quick fix and that it goes on, that actually it can be tough but positive, I think was really helpful to be able to see that for other siblings. So our future, I then thought, well, actually this was only 10 kids. I had 23 in that age group, but actually I went back and I surveyed them all. I wanted to see what the rest of the siblings felt. And yes, they very much wanted events. They wanted to be part of our whole team, and they wanted to be thought about. The strategy with the psychosocial team is about that siblings, while they may have been mentioned before, need to be updated throughout the pathway and need to be updated throughout the years of transplantation. The sibling information still hasn't been fully developed because it's with the sibling group. They are actually doing it for me, and in actual fact, it's been a long piece of string, so it needs to get chilled on. But again, siblings are now included in our parent information. It's about planning and doing that support for them in the longer term. And we've developed some sibling events, so we've involved them in a recent choir that Pankaj has developed, and the siblings are a real part of that. And at the transplant games, the young people now, we have a sibling morning whereby the transplant recipients are backstage and the siblings now have centre stage with us. So thanks very much. That's essentially my quick overview of the transplant sibling experience.
Great presentation. Oh, a question already?
Firstly, I just want to congratulate you. I think this is a really fantastic piece of work, and I think it's really interesting. I wanted to ask specifically about resilience. Was that something that you found? I mean, I know you mentioned it sort of briefly, but specifically, did the young people say, actually, I feel, I mean, the theme that you named was, wise but beyond your years, but was there anything specifically that they referred to in terms of other difficulties in their life where they referred back to this as being, well, actually, we've been through this, we've got through this, it means that I can go on and do other things?
It didn't actually come out, which I was surprised about, and I think resilience has probably become a more defined word since then. I didn't actually involve it in the discussions because in actual fact I left it very much open to them. I think one of the things that they found, I mean, it was so cathartic, and the parents were told that they weren't going to have the information shared with them unless there was obviously something I was psychologically worried about. But on one of the first occasions, we left the room and a father was standing outside, and there was obvious brain tears in the room, and he said, well, how did that go? And I sort of looked at him as if to say, don't ask, I'm not going to talk to you about it. And he said, I can see it went really well. And I think one of the things that probably comes from resilience was, and I didn't mention it in my presentation, was actually it depended on whether the recipient was the older or the younger with how some of them coped with it. The ones that were the older sibling felt that they had had time to have family time, that they knew what it was like to be in a, if you want to put it in inverted commas, normal family.
And did you find gender, any differences in gender between sisters?
No. And in actual fact, one of the pairs in the group were actually the same transplant recipient, and they actually had quite different views on life.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Grainne. That was phenomenal. I was going to ask you if you looked at single-parent families, if you looked at the differences between deceased donor and living donor, for example, where one parent is undergoing the donation process as the live donor nephrectomy, and the other parent is actually with the child, and compared that to deceased donor transplant, because I think in ATOM, in the adult study, there was a lot which came up about the psychological effects and not getting your life back to normal as well, because you're undergoing, you know, two members of the family potentially having an operation.
I didn't do a huge amount of statistics on this at all. It was very much a qualitative piece of work, but the 10 children that were presented were from various different. I'm not sure whether we broke down single parent versus none, but there was certainly older and younger, and there was certainly deceased donor versus live donation.
Because there might be even a bit more resentment that both parents are actually not there.
Absolutely.
And you really are getting farmed out at the time of the transplant.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Last question.
Thought I was escaping.
I was really struck by the video from the team yesterday with the hemodialysis, and there was a little clip where the little boy's getting dialysis and his sister's there.
Yeah.
Do you get siblings coming in for dialysis, and how do you incorporate the siblings into all of these discussions? And
so it's interesting that my dialysis colleagues are in the background, so maybe they could comment on the dialysis. Certainly I've made, when I'm having pre-transplant discussions and then in clinic afterwards, I make real efforts and help fund at least once a year trip for a sibling, because normally the parent gets transport costs or whatever, and the recipient, but I make efforts that they're more than welcome to bring a sibling at least once a year, and we will fund that, because some of them are a long way away from our centre, and in actual fact to involve them with that. Guys, do you want to comment about dialysis, about the siblings there?
Yeah, but I think reunions, especially during the holidays,
just part of the family, the child and the parents and everybody, we just treat them all as part of the family.
But it turns out they don't get the opportunity to come up on a regular basis.
School.
School generally, yeah. But as Tinu said, it's school holidays and weekends and
they're always there, they're involved. And we have play specialists that work with them as well when they're on the units. So they're very much involved.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.